Hello and welcome to the Sci-Fi Show, where tonight we're going to be discussing whether whether sacred spaces exist, and we're going to be asking questions. Yeah, sacred spaces. Spacious now, excellent. So we're going to talk about things like what makes a space sacred. Is there anything more than the people that make it sacred? We're going to talk about holy sites like Mecca and the Kabba and all of that sort of thing, and we're going to see if there is anything above what there really is about making a space sacred. All that and more is coming up on the Sci-Fi Show. So welcome to the Fresh Air Sci-Fi Show, where the heat is completely destroying my brain, and I think I'm still Joe.
Yeah, and I don't know who I am anymore. It's just too damn hot.
Dave's not here.
He's definitely not.
So I hope you're all well and you've been doing your best to keep cool in this heat. Fantastic to see you all. And I do apologize for me fumbling over my words there at the beginning, although something tells me that it's going to be, well, the way this one's going to go. So tonight we're going to be discussing if sacred spaces exist, and we have to answer questions to, for example, as, what is a sacred space? What makes a space sacred? What are the different sacred spaces around the world, and what's the differences between them? What elevates one space above another? So Dave, why don't you start us off and just tell us what a sacred space is?
I mean, there's loads of ways to look at it these days. A sacred space today would simply be a revered space or a reserved space, I guess. But in the old days, what it was a kind of holy site, or a place that had been blessed and kind of given over to the gods or been elevated by the gods. So the site was seen as holy and off grounds, and it belonged to the gods. And like if you think of a church, that is a sacred space. It's supposed to contain and embody the spirit of God and that kind of thing. But today, I guess you would have like sacred spaces, which are, if you think about, say, the grave site of some important person, might be a sacred space. In America, you have the graveyard with for the fallen soldiers or whatever it is. So you could consider that a kind of sacred space. It's off limits. People are expected to behave in certain ways in it, and they're supposed to revere the people in the graves, that kind of thing.
Because there's a sort of honor and respect for what they've done for their country. But is there still any religious aspect to that sort of reverence?
I think so, in a sort of civil religion kind of way.
Mm-hmm.
So these are put forward as kind of martyrs for the government who are fighting for whichever god looks over the nation. In a civil religion, it's not necessarily the Christian God, or the Muslim God or something like that. It's just this all-powerful deity, creator of the universe, or it can be kind of deistic. And so I think there is a kind of element in that as well. But rather than being blessed by the gods for the gods, it's blessed by the people in charge who tend to speak for the gods in those cases. It's kind of more complicated, but yeah, I think there can be a kind of quasi-religious element to it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We've had a couple of comments from Lone Wolf. He says, couldn't this whole question be melted down to, do sacred things exist? Full stop. You're probably right, but we're focusing on the spaces itself, and maybe through tonight's conversation you'll find an answer to that overall question as well. He also says, the idea of sacred things is drastically different between the Far East and the Western worlds. Do you want to field that one, Dave?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I mean, sacred spaces in the Far East can be just sort of like places of knowledge can be kind of sacred. Whereas here, sacred is generally linked to some kind of religion or to some kind of monument to some person that plays a part in the history of that country. It kind of really depends. Like in Japan, if you think about sacred.
Sorry, we lost you there for a second. In Japan?
Like you have the Buddhist temples that are seen as sacred. But you also have certain forests that are seen as sacred, mostly because, you know, the history, it's famous, or like an old samurai.
Again there, Dave.
Ooh, I'm sorry. Doesn't seem to be doing too well tonight.
No.
Weird. But yeah, it is kind of different in the way that they approach things.
Is it there's still that reverence there, it's just a different context of reverence?
It's a different kind of, yeah, it's just what they revere is different because the culture and the history is different. And if you think about a country like Japan, it doesn't really have this overall uniting religion like, say, or the US does. So there's all kinds of different sacred spaces. And generally you'll find people respecting those sacred spaces, even if they don't follow them and they follow some other religion.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. I mean, even when not even going to the Far East, if you look at, for example, the Hindu faith, for example, there is a lot of respect for other cultures and other religions. I mean, I know sometimes people can be sent into a moral panic, but in general, they have a lot of respect for the other religions, and they believe that it's all sort of different ways of, Brahmins, sending down a different god, but it's all still part of their religion overall. And so that gives them that sort of respect for it. And you can even get, Christian Hindus, not that Christians would regard them as Christians, but yeah, so you can see that there are different parts of the world where the level of respect can be for different reasons. As you mentioned, knowledge. You can see some places where there is a center of knowledge, or perhaps even great works of art being revered and respected and seen as sacred to some people. But is that the sort of sacredness you're speaking of tonight?
I suppose it could be, because I'm more speaking of sacred in a more overall general term, but also using that kind of religious version of sacredness. The blessed by the gods, or this space has been anointed by the gods, and therefore there's something more to this space than just the space itself. So, like, you'll get people who say when they go into a church, they feel a kind of love and they'll feel the sacredness of the place. But the question is, do they? I mean, if you think about who is the guy who was the mass shooter in America?
Which one?
Who went into the black? Yeah.
What day?
He went into the
Tuesday.
black church. He went into the black church and he killed a bunch of people. And when they arrested him, they basically gave him a hamburger and stuff. I can't really remember his name now, Rufus or something like that. But he was a Christian. But yet he still went into this Christian church and killed a bunch of people. So if there was something sacred about that space, and God lived in that space, then why was nothing done to stop this?
Well, I mean, a callback to that conversation that we had with Emerson when he was talking about being in a charismatic church. And he was actually saying, you know, a lot of the love and the feelings that brought them all together was the music that was playing. And if he played a bum note on his guitar, people started losing some of their feelings. So it could just be a case of there's this expectation of a feeling going in, and you're like, oh, because people have that regardless of the religion that they're in, don't they? They're expecting to feel a certain way, and they're like, oh, can't you feel the love here? You know, God is here, whichever one it is.
Yeah, exactly. Dylan Roof, that's the, as Dave just pointed out, Dylan Roof, that's the shooter I was thinking of. But it shows that even a Christian who finds their own church to be this sacred thing can go into another of the same denomination and not feel that sacredness of the site. And if you think about the Kabba in Mecca, that's supposed to be the site of sites when it comes to Islam, isn't it? That, you know, the cube is the site of sites. People go, yeah. It's basically the board getting ready, you know.
I thought it's where they just filmed the movie.
Yeah. But they call that place sacred, and they say that you can get this sense from it. You have the people who wander around it. You'll get claims from Muslims, I don't know if you've ever heard these, that the Kaaba is the thing you can see from outer space, and astronauts have said you can see the Kaaba shining from outer space. Planes can't fly overhead. Birds can't fly over it. They'll fly around it and that kind of thing. But yet, if you look into the history of the Kaaba, it's been destroyed before by other Muslims. So if there really is this thing that makes it sacred and makes it above just being a building, then why don't people of the same religion, even if it's a slightly different denomination, feel that same level of sacredness towards it?
Yeah,
surely,
no, totally agree.
If there was this property, then others would feel it too. And if you think of the Taliban destroying Buddhist statues, they clearly don't see them as sacred, even though another group sees them as sacred. Think about the old Inca temples, the Aztecs. The Spanish went over there and just kind of had a party with them. I want your gold. Yeah. So where is this property? And if you were to argue something like, well, that's because these were all false gods, then it would seem to me that all gods are false, according to that argument, because there is no one space that is sacred for everybody. I mean, think of the amount of Native American graveyards that have been desecrated through the years and things like that. One sacred space might not be might not be sacred to someone else, but even those who live within that same kind of religion might also not find the space sacred.
Like you mentioned with the
because,
Christianity example,
yeah,
because there was a problem with that particular Christian church, and yeah, I mean, Claire says, I think what a lot of us think about this, the atmosphere setting, vibe, call it what you will, but it's indeed generated by humans in attendance. So therefore, how is that sacred? So I think this is a good point. Like, it doesn't matter what it is, but I think one key thing that gets this vibe going is a lot of people thinking the same way about the same thing, and I think people do feed off of each other's emotions. I don't know if you've ever been to places where everybody's happy in the room, and it can just make you feel that little bit happier, even if you're determined to stay in the bad mood that you're in. Like, it can help you feel a little bit better. I mean, sometimes it can go the other way if you're feeling really that low, but you can get on the vibe with something, especially if you allow yourself, if you want to feel that vibe. And a lot of people who are going into these churches and things like that, they want to feel this way about things. They're looking for that, and they get it. And so, yeah, it's definitely generated by humans, as far as we can tell, in pretty much every instance. So, is a feeling generated by humans something that could be considered sacred?
I would say that it could be, depending. Like, if we think about these sacred spaces now that we've been talking about, what we just mentioned about atmosphere, setting, vibe, people bringing it to it. Sacred just seems to be this shared story among a group of people who then consider that place to be sacred and bring that vibe to that space. So you could say that sacred spaces do exist in that sense, as a shared story. But if you were to take somebody who didn't know that shared story and put them in that space, would they feel it? It seems unlikely.
Especially if they were on their own.
Yeah, that's it. And like, a lot of people get this sense of reverence when they go into a church. But if you think about it, we've been brought up being taught that these are things to revere. And some people even get that sense just from the architecture alone. I mean, when you think about how nice Gothic churches look and the architecture, you can get a sense of reverence. But then are people mistaking that reverence that they have for the great work for some feeling that is in that building that is bestowed upon it by some greater being?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that sort of reverence, as you mentioned, is not necessarily tied to any sort of greater being. And if it was, these sacred spaces, like you mentioned earlier, wouldn't actually be desecrated by anyone, especially not by people from within the same religion. And as we've seen and you described, in both Christianity and Islam, it's happened from Muslims and Christians destroying some of their own spaces. So there's obviously not a divine intervention of what is sacred there, but there is still that intersubjective sacredness, perhaps.
Yeah, exactly. And Dave and Claire both brought up some excellent things there. Dave says the idea of sacred walks hand in hand with the sacrosanct. There are places that are too important to be interfered with. And if you take that back through history, that does seem to describe a lot of sacred spaces. The Kabba is too important to Islam to be interfered with. It's a part of this great tradition and this great history. And if you think of the story that's told about it, like it's been there since, I can't remember who they said built it. It wasn't Abraham, I don't think, but it goes way back. And if it gets destroyed, then all of those stories that they've told about how it's indestructible, about how planes can't fly over it, about how it shines and how it's protected from God, if anything happens to it, all that gets destroyed, causes doubt, all that kind of thing. So it becomes this place where if people allow it to be interfered with, it causes greater damage. So even if we don't feel that sense of sacredness, they have to protect that sense of sacredness. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And like Claire says, sacred is a way of making something go by unchallenged. The story of the first Thanksgiving in America is a sacred story because it tells this tale of survivorship and how America is this country where they want to build up this nation of great people, and the original people survived to build up this great land. But in reality, none of it actually happened that way. So the story becomes sacred because in order to protect that unity and that civil religion, that story has to be protected.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. So sacredness is really a human attempt at trying to make something remain unchallenged. It may have so there's almost two sides there, isn't there? There's the collective feeling of something that makes it sacred, and saying something is sacred to generate a feeling like that because you would rather it be unchallenged, and you're using truth pragmatically.
yeah, basically. You're creating a sense of community, which is important when holding a nation together, or even if you go back further, it's important for holding a tribe together. You think of the destruction of the Jewish temple. When that happened, the dysphoria happened, and Jews were scattered across the land. So that sacredness of that temple was kind of keeping those people together. And once it was destroyed, it was God's punishing us. We have to go and make amends, and it kind of separated everything and caused people to go on this sort of expansion, or not expansion, but running away, trying to find out what they've done, how to fix it. And then the story became, well, there's going to be this Messiah who comes back and rebuilds the temple. And so the sacred spaces also act as a form of unity. You think of a church in any neighborhood, especially if it's like a shared in a small town. That kind of unites the town. So the whole town kind of sees it as sacred because of that unity.
Yeah, it makes sense. I wonder though if really we should be referring to it as sacred and allowing the excuses. Like you mentioned, there's some things that are thought of as being, unbreakable, but then they get broken. And then there's a story that's then told, oh, it's because of God's wrath because we've allowed something to happen in some country or whatever, and that's why it's broken. They've told another story. They've tried to level up the sacredness again using truth pragmatically, and that is to say they're not telling the truth.
Yeah, but there may be a rational reason for using the truth in that way. I mean, if you think about it, the religion still unites this group of people all across the world. There's still all these customs. And you think about the Muslim, Salam Alaikum. That's a greeting that goes worldwide and knows it unites the people. And it kind of gives that feeling of, well, we're all blessed by God. And it allows them to hear, or not hear, sorry, very hot and still very tired. It allows them to recognize other Muslims immediately. And if you think about the dress code that many of them have, like, the trousers 3 inches short from the ankle and the caps or, the kind of clothes, Sikhs with the turbans, it allows them to recognize the turbans are seen as a kind of sacred thing. If you think about the allowances that are made, I think in Canada, the RCMP, they're allowed to wear the turbans now, and there was the hard fight in the UK for bobbies to be able to wear turbans if they're Sikh.
Mm-hmm.
So these things are seen as sacred and protected, and there are stories behind why that is.
Yeah. And I'm not saying you shouldn't allow people to have sacred spaces, but the excuses that come from it to try and maintain a sacred space. I know some people might put it down, oh, well, it's because of free will, man. It's like, yeah, but if it's unbreakable, if there's this thing that is unbreakable and it breaks, if it's this thing that a plane can't fly over and a plane flies over it, whatever the story is, if the story doesn't hold up, surely that should be something to encourage people to reconsider and to dispel the fact that it's sacred at all, at least in the divine sense. There can still be the sort of community sacredness that we were talking about. Sacred might not necessarily be the right word, but I suppose it is something revered in a way as if it was divine without it actually being divine.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's also another kind of good thing that comes out of what you were just mentioning with the whole story that's told. If you think about the removal of the statues of somebody like General Lee in America recently, toppling the statues, the thing that brought about Portland and Charlottesville, that kind of thing. Those monuments were sacred to white nationalists and to the racists and to the hangers-on of the Confederacy. But for those who were impacted, destroying that sacred space acts as a kind of catharsis and lets people know that, we no longer hold this thing to be sacred. We're no longer afraid of the power of this thing. So I think sacred spaces can also be used in that kind of cathartic way.
Destroying them. Destroying the sacred spaces and the sacred things.
Is destroying the past. Yeah.
So you could say that if, I don't know, people who maybe feel oppressed by the church in a country, if they were to, if it was a really, really oppressive country that was trying to influence all of their laws and things like that, if their people actually rallied and destroyed that church, it would potentially have some benefit to it too.
It would have like a freeing element to them. And moving forward from the religious thing, if we look at Saddam Hussein's Iraq, there were statues of him everywhere, and they were considered sacred, but that was because it was kind of forced. If you were to do something to that statue, then you would be harmed.
Much in the way it is in Korea as well.
Yeah, if you don't have the pictures of the founding fathers on your wall, you're going to get put in a camp. So they're seen as sacred. But those people might not have that reverence for it. There is a lot of people who do in North Korea. They see Kim Jong, the Kim family, as kind of saviors of the nation. But even those who don't believe that are forced to take part in that ceremony in a sort of, Korea is a pretty good example of a civil religion. It's not based on, like a god type thing. It's based on this story that's told to create a godlike figure that everybody unites around. Now, if you think about all those people who've had families wrecked by the Kim family, who's, they didn't bow enough, they didn't watch enough TV, the news, so they got put in a camp. When that gets toppled, think of the catharsis that they will get from tearing down those statues, from showing this is no longer something. So sacred spaces can have like a double-edged sword to them. Of course, it'd probably be better to not have those sacred spaces as such, because they can also cause animosity. I mean, you look at the violence in Charlottesville. The white nationalists considered the Robert E. Lee to be sacred, untouchable, part of the history. People shouldn't be messing with it. They're proud of that history. So violence can happen when protecting these sacred spaces.
Yeah, so I suppose it causes, humans are tribal creatures anyway, and sort of these sacred spaces and sacred things can intensify the tribalism, especially under people who either are really in or really out of that environment. Just a couple of comments as well. So Rev says a graveyard isn't divine, but it's sacred. There's probably a better word. I mean, we brought that up earlier. Like, even if you remove that sort of divine part of the graveyard, there's that sort of respect and reverence for the dead that you'd have there. So you'd be expected to behave in a certain way, even if it was a fully atheist graveyard, for example. There'd still be that, sacredness, but we'd probably use a better term, because when people say sacred, we think of the religious context, and that's how it all pops up into our mind. We're almost programmed to think of that, so we'd turn around and go, well, no, that's not sacred. But we treat these things in a very similar way to things that do have that link to something that is considered divine, regardless of whether that divine is there or not. So sacred isn't necessarily a bad word for it, but I do think that you could use a different word to prevent any sort of issues with someone assuming that you're talking about some form of divinity, and reverence or respect, or that sort of thing would work. Claire says, the forcing of the sacred belief is what I object to personally. What is sacred to one is not to another. I could say my sacred space is living in truth, and not everyone would agree. I mean, this sort of ties into what you're talking about with Kim Jong-un and the Kim family. It's basically people being forced into a as you say, a civil religion. They have to act with all these things as if they are sacred, but it can happen on a smaller scale, on a community scale. People have to go to church. You see it as kids are growing up in their families. They have to adopt the beliefs of their parents, and if they don't, they could be beaten or ostracized, completely kicked out of the community for and home and all sorts. A number of negative things can come out of rejecting a forced sacred belief, and the problem there as well is the more you force something like that, the more chance you're going to have is of someone rejecting it. And a slightly more lax attitude of, well, this is what we believe, we'd like you to come here, but find your own path for a bit and then come back to us and talk about it, might not cause such a divisive element as well.
Sort of like the Amish do with the Frumstringer.
Yeah,
I think it's called.
I can't remember what it's called, but TV has taught me they let them go away for about a year.
Yeah, they go out, they party, and then they come back if they want or stay away. Yeah. But again, I think a lot of people who decide not to go back are sort of, they've broken that sacred bond, and therefore they're not really welcome back in the community, from what I understand anyway.
Yeah. There was an Amish community, I think it was, in the TV show Banshee. Don't know if you ever watched that.
No, I've never watched it. The only Amish community show I watched was something called Pure,
Oh no, I've not
which
seen
was
that one.
about it's really good. It's about heroin dealers in the Amish community, and they hide in the Amish community because nobody ever thinks to go look there, and it's a really good show.
Yeah, fair. I need to get back to watching Banshee. Actually, I think I only watched the first season, but the guy who plays Homelander's the main character in it. So it's the only other thing I think I've seen him in, and I saw him in it in this show years ago. But he's basically someone who's got out of jail.
He pretends to be the sheriff or
Yes,
something.
that's it. Yeah. Shit goes down and he ends up pretending to be the new sheriff of Banshee. But yeah, other than that, I won't spoil it. But it was really, really, really entertaining first season. I hope the show continued as that did. So Kimo says, not exactly sacred. A graveyard is generally considered inviolate. I think that's sort of another great way to put it. Really, it's something that is kind of treated as sacred in the same way you could. It's not the same thing, but you could say that it's sort of synonymous. Mark says, isn't it funny that sacred and scared are so similar? Yeah, it'd be interesting to look at the roots of those two words and see if there's actually any similarity through their coining within the English language. No?
No, because we studied this in my first year of my undergrad, like what is sacred and that kind of thing. And it's not to do with that. It's to do with religious anointing.
Something being sacrilegious?
Yeah, essentially. Yeah.
Interesting. Most people are scared sacred. Yes, some people are definitely forced down that path, like we mentioned within North Korea and even smaller communities and homes. So where were we, Dave?
I think Kimo raises a good point, though. I think inviolate becomes one of the properties of something being sacred. Generally, if we see something as inviolate, we kind of raise it above anywhere else and make it into a kind of sacred space. And there's an opposite end to this as well. If you consider Auschwitz, it's not considered sacred in a religious way. There's this horrible, terrible thing that happened there, something that, inhumane, and we never want it to go, we never want it to happen again. And that place is considered sacred, not in the religious sense, but in the inviolate sense. And in the sense that, this is a place where we're supposed to hold our tongue, we're supposed to respect it. And that can have a good thing. Because if you think of what's going on there, imagine somebody turning that into a nightclub. Yeah.
I mean,
you would feel something is wrong with that.
Yeah, you would.
Yeah. Nazis might not, obviously, or, neo-Nazis and white nationalists, et cetera. But keeping that in that sort of sacred sense means that whenever we see these people who are like, let's just bulldoze it, nothing bad really happened. It was just 6,000 people. They just had a bad reaction to defleeing powder, all those kind of the showers were just sterilization things. And there's a lot of that goes on in that sort of white nationalist community.
Yeah.
But we also know that anybody who looks at Auschwitz in that way, in this non-sacred way, is somebody to not be associated with. So in some sense, this shared story of the sanctity of Auschwitz and what it represents can enable us to see people that are bad and to be rejected from the regular communities.
Yeah. Or at least attempts made to help them understand things a little
Why
bit
it's
better.
yeah,
You know,
yeah.
rather than rejected. I don't like the idea of being totally tribal.
Oh no, but it enables us to pick out people who might not be thinking correctly, so to speak.
Yeah.
I don't think
It's a
there's many
shortcut.
of those sites. Yeah. I don't think there's many of those sites that exist. But, they can actually help in that sense as well. Like I keep saying, sacredness, it can be considered a kind of double-edged sword, whichever way we use the word, whether it's in the religious sense or in the sense of some space set aside that's inviolate and meant to be respected.
Now, that makes a lot of sense. So you'd sort of say that would you agree then? I mean, I'm sure a theist wouldn't agree, but if there was a divine form of sacred space, that it would have to uphold its story, and no addition to the story, no amendments to it. It's like, oh yeah, but the reason this happened was because God decided something else. Would you say that shouldn't happen, especially if the original commandment was God saying this will never be broken, because God would know all things, especially if we're talking about the omni-God that you'd find in Christianity or Islam. God would be able to know the future, and if it says it'll never be destroyed and it gets destroyed, then perhaps. But you'd argue that there is a form of sacred space in the sense of these inviolate sacred spaces.
I do, but I still think they're shared stories.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if you took somebody who had never heard of Auschwitz and you stuck them there, they would probably feel the morbidity of it because of how it looks and that kind of thing. But they wouldn't have that same sense as somebody who knew what went on there, knew the amount of lives that were lost there, knew the terrible experiments that went on there. For them, it might just look like a prison camp. So they would have that sense of, this is kind of foreboding. Because let's face it, the Germans, the Nazis, they built it to look foreboding. They built it to look scary. And you can get that sense from kind of any building. You think about an old dilapidated building and you get that kind of, maybe that's not such a safe place to go into, or, something like that. Now, a good way to explain this is, you've seen the Amityville Horror?
No, I don't think I have.
Get out.
Okay.
Yeah, go on, get out, Philistine. But the house. Like, it's got the two windows up at the top that look like eyes looking out and all that kind of stuff. If you've seen the film and you know the story and you know the history and you recognize it, you'll get that sense of, ooh, that's kind of creepy. But it's not from the way it looks, it's from the stories that are built up around it. But somebody who didn't know those stories might just look at it and go, oh, it's a house. It's an old house in New England. And I think that would be kind of the feeling that you got when you went into Auschwitz if you do nothing about it. But if it truly was this space where there was some other property to it, like you said, you would think that you would feel this extra thing. And the same with a church or mosque or anything like that. That's my opinion anyway.
The feeling would be completely objective and apply to everyone regardless of knowledge. I mean, I know that sounds kind of an oxymoron, an objective feeling, but I mean that vibe would be present in the thing, and anyone that comes across that thing has that imparted onto them in the exact same way as everyone else, as unless there's some sort of issue where you can't feel things or something, but within reason.
Yeah. I would think so anyway. You would get a sort of sense that you're in some place special.
Yeah.
And not just because of the story that's been told about it, but because there is just something special and otherworldly about this place. Because otherwise, what does it mean for something to be divine?
Yeah. And even if it's not a divine one, you'd expect that feeling to still be there. Like you mentioned with Auschwitz, there will be a feeling because of your understanding of architecture and the way things look and all of that, but you wouldn't necessarily have the same feeling if you didn't know the story. So with all of these things, it's the story that gives it the power. The experience, or past experience of the way things look. I mean, you could be someone who's never come across anything that looks like that before, and you might not have any negative feelings to a prison, no matter how bad it looks, a prison camp, I mean. So you might just look at it and go, bit shabby here.
Yeah.
You could even think of it like that, but there is nothing within the object itself that generates that same foreboding for everyone. So there is, in a way, only relativistic sacredness.
That's how I would see it anyway. I mean, if you think of like Buddhist temples in Japan, they look amazing. They look beautiful. I get this sense of like, not awe, that's not quite the right word, but I find them to be some of the most fascinating buildings and some of the best looking buildings, and you can see the history and the age when you look at them. But I don't feel anything else unless I start thinking about, well, this is a place where people worship for years. People find peace in these places. You can go there and get food. But, it's that kind of sense. I think that's the closest you'll ever get to something having a feeling of sacred, is whatever aesthetic feeling you get from that space.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Just going to answer this one. Mark says, Joe, I'm enjoying your vids about your journey through ADHD. I hope it goes well for you. Thank you, Mark. I just started doing it on TikTok originally, just as a sort of a way to track myself, and it was being a bit cathartic, and then we just decided to that maybe we should put them as a playlist on YouTube as well. It's generally going quite well at the moment. I'm almost caught up to the ones I've posted on TikTok as well, so I'll start reposting them at the same time. It's definitely going well in a number of different ways, and there's no real negatives at the moment. So hopefully it will continue that way. And thank you for saying you enjoy it. I didn't actually think anyone would check them out at all. It was more for my own benefit. See that, that's my little sacred space, you see. There's no real sacredness to it, but it's something that I'm using, and I regard it as it should be, inviolate.
I mean, that does bring up kind of a good point. Sorry, I'm just gonna see if that fixes the lighting, but no. Are people starting to see places like Twitter and Facebook as kind of sacred spaces? I mean, you think about the hoopla about Trump being banned, how it's not right. The government should take control of Twitter, stop this censorship. Are people starting to see that as a space where they have this profile that exists that is to be treated as inviolate, and certain rights on the platform that are to be treated as sort of inviolate and sacred? Are we now building up these new spaces as sacred spaces?
That definitely raises a really good point. I mean, I think that there is a certain amount of that going on. People don't like it when, well, I mean, it's a private platform and they feel that they should have these rights that they would have in the legal system of their country on that platform. Well, no, it's a private platform. That's only doesn't apply to a private platform. It applies to the public, and it only that particular rule only applies to your country, and this is a worldwide thing, and but also people see them as sacred in the way that if there's any changes, I mean, do you remember the number of times Facebook has changed its format and everybody's been up in arms about the changes? I mean, there's some of them that have really pissed me off in the past as well, but some people take them really seriously and like, if you do this, Facebook,
an attack on them.
Yeah, I'm gonna leave Facebook if you do this.
Yeah, absolutely. I can give you an even simpler example of that, which is a little more crazy. Do you watch South Park?
I do, but I'm a couple of seasons behind.
Yeah, I am. But do you remember about season 10, 11 maybe? They changed it to a 3D intro from the original intro. It's now the bus driving through and it's computer animated. People went loopy when that happened. They threatened the creators. They threatened, Matt and Trey, and said they were going to kill him for changing it. And how dare they do this thing? So you could say that they kind of saw that Facebook intro as sacred. It belonged to them. There was some property in it that was above being allowed to be changed because they had this story about it, I guess. It did something for them. But yeah, people tend to project these things onto things. And this is another idea where it shows that it's a kind of, even if it's not a shared story, it's a story that they tell themselves that makes that space sacred. Yeah. And yeah, Primus. The Primus was still in there. It was just the actual animation that changed.
Yeah. It's funny, isn't it? I mean, we do, as a species, get really caught up in stuff like this. We tie ourselves to it and it doesn't seem to make much sense to me as to why we do. I can't explain it anyway.
No, I can't. It's a weird psychological trait of humans where they anchor themselves into these things. And if those things are changed, then I guess that they see that it's a change in themselves or the security that they have. I mean, if you think of sacred spaces, another thing about them is there's this sense of security about them. Like if you think most people who go to a church have a sense of security in there, maybe not the choir boys.
Yeah.
But, the people going in worshiping, they feel safe. They feel the sense of love. They feel the sense of peace. They feel the sense of joy. Like Emerson said, when they start playing the music, there's this feeling of being protected. And that is another reason why they're kind of considered sacred. So I guess if, like, the intro to South Park made them feel safe, it brought them that little bit of joy with the music and the little animation, it becomes something above just the intro to South Park. It becomes this story that they tell themselves and this attachment and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I get it. I get why it happens. It's just... Yeah, it seems like out of this world that someone should get so tied into things like, a South Park intro, that it would feel like that. It's a cartoon at the end of the day, and it's brilliant satire. It absolutely is. But. Going so to the point of threatening the creators because they've changed the intro, and Lone Wolf did pick a point. it's they changed the song as well. It didn't sound the same, even though it was Les playing the intro. And it's true, they did change it, so it became, they got that heavier guitar going going through it at some point. I can't remember what season that changed.
I don't remember that. I just remember the actual when the intro graphics changed rather than the song changed.
Yeah. But it's an extreme reaction to it. But I suppose if we tie this back to belief in general, and like what you were saying by that safety net as well. I mean, if we think about the safety net, say in a church, you used to only be able to have like male priests, and then some churches started allowing female priests, and it's sort of like making them question their beliefs because it was part of their doctrine that this is the way it should be. So it sort of challenges that and makes them think that maybe this church is being taken over, it's no longer sacred or something like that, so they lose that safety net. There's also the things where people say don't attack the believer, attack the belief, but the belief is actually tied into the ego. So if you're attacking rather than trying to have a nice discussion, it feels like an attack on the person because that belief is part of the person. It's hard to separate the belief and the person. And the same can be said about these sacred spaces and sacred things. There's part of their personality tied into them. And you can definitely understand it with certain things like the religious aspects or churchyards or things like that. It's just a little bit harder to understand the intro to a cartoon.
Another example, like keeping on with films and TV shows and stuff, what we mentioned in the Moral Panic video, the Our Lady of Heaven film.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing in that that really violates any kind of sacred space or anything like that. But apparently the film, for the first time, was an actor playing Muhammad, and it shows his face. And hence causing the outrage because it's seen as this sacred thing not to show his face. But then they're not really showing Muhammad's face, are they? They're showing an actor playing Muhammad's face.
That's true.
So they're not even really violating that sacred space. So it shows how weird the idea of sacred spaces can be and the stories that people tell each other about what is sacred. And I mean, to the makers of those films, they were Shia Muslims, and they didn't see anything wrong or sacrilegious about it. So again, it shows that even among the same religion, but different denominations, what's considered sacred is different.
Yeah. Yeah. So we're back to the point of it's relativistic. Does that give the sacred space any form of truth to it? Is it truly sacred because a community thinks it so?
Yeah. I don't think it does. I think we should respect what people find sacred to some degree. Like none of us want our grandparents' grave desecrated, and we don't want a bunch of goths going in and having a rave on top of our ancestors' graves. So I think there is some sense where we should respect other people's sacred things, but it really depends, because what happens when two sacred things clash? Like for us, freedom of expression is kind of sacred. And we hold that in high esteem, don't we? Mm-hmm. If somebody stops us being able to express ourselves, or if the country was to suddenly turn around and say, you can no longer say anything bad about Boris Johnson, we would be up in arms.
Yeah.
Like, but yet it's say it's, sacrilegious in this film that they showed the face, and the film's now been banned. So there's two sacred beliefs at war here. Which one needs to be respected?
Yes, indeed. So obviously you'd have to try and look at it objectively, but it sounds like sacredness is nothing more than a potentially useful fiction.
That's exactly what I would call it.
Yeah,
It's a useful fiction for within whatever community, or it's a way for us to find some mediated respect between communities. We respect this belief that you hold. So as a trade, you should respect this belief that we hold, but it very rarely turns out that way.
That's fair. That's fair. And Reason to Doubt has just jumped in. How you doing? And he says he's just catching up. And he was in Charlottesville for the riots, and it was intense. Yeah, I can imagine. Blimey.
Yeah, I wouldn't have wanted to be there.
No. Perhaps you can tell us about it at some point in the future. Be interesting to hear an insider's view. Although, if you don't want to, I don't blame you, because it's probably not that nice to talk about either. Wolf says, I've been forced to live through a few different events that forced me to reevaluate how I interact with the things that are considered sacred. Things that were sacred when I grew up are not sacred today. And that is true. And I think this goes back to it's sort of a relativistic, useful fiction. It has power and it has purpose, but it's not really like true in any sense of objective truth type thing. So yeah, interesting. Dave, I mean, I think we've sort of come full circle with, what are sacred things and do they exist? It's like, well, yes, but they're just useful fictions.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think sacred spaces exist in the way that many religious people claim they exist. But they certainly exist as, like you say, this useful fiction, this shared truth, or this shared fiction about some space. And I do think there are good reasons to respect some of them, but not necessarily all of them. But there should be nothing so sacred that it is beyond question.
Agreed. Question everything, even me saying that.
Yeah.
That's fair enough. Was there anything else you thought would be useful to cover tonight?
No, that's pretty much it. I just had a nice general discussion on sacred spaces, what they are, how we see them, that kind of thing. It might just nice change of pace.
Yeah, no, definitely. It was an interesting discussion, and I'd never thought about it before in the way of sacred being this sort of useful fiction. In my head, it was like it's a placeholder word to describe a few attributes, but I think it's helped me sort of go, yeah, it's a form of fictionalism about this thing, and it makes a lot of sense that it is used that way, and you can see how it can bind people together. You can see how it can drive people apart. And that we should try and look at things that are considered sacred as objectively as possible, and take any emotion out of it, consider why they're seen as sacred, see the positives, see the negatives that come from it, and perhaps make a decision based on the facts rather than, well, this community thinks it's so we should just respect that. Although in general, as you say, we should try and respect traditions and things that are held sacred by other people as much as we can, as long as it doesn't infringe in human rights or cause any immoral actions.
Yeah, absolutely agree.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for coming here tonight, Dave. It's been a great show, and thank you to everybody out there. And before we go, I would just like to say you should check out our video that we did on moral panic, and also check out Dave's videos that he's uploaded today. I think it was, wasn't it, Dave?
Yeah, it was.
I'll put them up in a little playlist for you to all check out later as well. Have a good night, all.
Thank you.